Over the past year of Israel's war in Gaza, numerous international diplomatic and humanitarian organizations, including the UN, have repeatedly accused Israel of violating rules of international humanitarian law and military conduct. These violations have sparked public statements, condemnations, and even provisional measures from the world's highest courts. What's been missing, however, are conditions that have consequences. If any authority has the power to influence Israel's actions, it'll be the US, Israel's strongest ally and largest provider of military aid. The death toll in Gaza has exceeded 42,000 people, with thousands under rubble and tens of thousands dying from indirect causes. Since the start of October, the north of the Strip has been isolated, besieged, denied any aid, and almost 500,000 people have been issued forced displacement orders while hospitals have come under attack. In Lebanon, where densely populated neighbourhoods are being hit by airstrikes, at least 2,300 people have been killed and 1.2 million people are displaced. Earlier this year, the International Court of Justice determined it's plausible that Israel may be committing genocide in Gaza. Investigators and human rights groups have cautioned the US that it may be complicit in war crimes because of Israel's unlawful use of American weapons. In a rare development this week, a leaked document revealed US officials warning their Israeli counterparts that future weapons shipments could be impacted if the humanitarian crisis in Gaza isn't addressed within 30 days, after the presidential elections on November 5th. The document also called for an end to Israel's isolation of northern Gaza. At the same time, Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati said the US has, quote, kind of guaranteed that Israel would reduce its escalation in the southern suburbs and Beirut. But with little change in the past year, and with Israel often appearing to defy any limits imposed on it, the question remains, does the US have any red lines when it comes to its support of Israel? Just last month, the US indicated that Israel would conduct a limited operation in Lebanon. Instead, Israel carried out its ongoing invasion of the country's south. In May, President Biden said an assault on Rafah in Gaza would be a red line, but Israel then conducted several deadly attacks there. At the time, Biden paused a weapons shipment which was later released in July, while a record $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel was approved by Congress in the past year. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, ahead of a looming Israeli strike on Iran, and as tensions escalate across the region, we examine the US's role in the war and its seemingly unconditional support for its most strategic ally in the Middle East, Israel. America's stance on Gaza has fueled mass protests across the country since the start of the war, with growing demand that their government instate a ceasefire and more recently impose an arms embargo on Israel altogether. But US policy has also frustrated government employees and officials, leading a string of resignations. One of them is Hala Rarit, who resigned from the State Department in April after an 18-year career as a US diplomat. She joins me today to speak about her decision to leave and to share her analysis of what she calls a, quote, failed Gaza policy. A leaked letter sent by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to their Israeli counterparts states that Israel has 30 days to improve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza or risk access to arms shipments. What do you make of this in terms of its timing and its contents, knowing that a presidential election is on November 5th, that is before the 30-day grace period is over? And do you think that the US would follow through on this condition if Israel falls short on delivering?
Well, Neda, I think you pointed out the obvious in your question by calling out the fact that the elections are within that 30-day time frame. I want to be hopeful, but I also have to be realistic, considering the fact that this administration has placed red line after red line, yet every single time those red lines are not just passed, but absolutely obliterated. The administration refuses to shift policy. And for me, as an American diplomat that served for 18 years, it is abundantly clear that we are currently in violation of US law. The administration does not need another 30 days to make that determination. It has been over the course of a year getting evidence, ample evidence from its own experts from within the US government, showing that we are in violation of not only the Foreign Assistance Act, which this particular letter alludes to in terms of 620I, in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of Leahy vetting, in terms of the Arms Export Control Act. So for me, this unfortunately is really nothing but a PR stunt, but it's too little too late. And what do we expect to happen in the next 30 days? We are actually seeing the situation get worse literally the day after the letter was released. Aid workers, and most particularly doctors, are no longer allowed in Gaza, in northern Gaza. Northern Gaza has been completely sealed off. Nothing has improved. How many people are we willing to sacrifice in the next 30 days? And the fact that this letter was conveniently leaked, to me, shows that it is an election plot, because it's basically telling those voters that are not wanting to vote for Kamala Harris because of the implications that she has with this conflict, just vote for us, hold out 30 days, and we'll get you something right after the election. We're talking about human lives. We're talking about families. We're talking about entire families destroyed. And it is absolutely shameful. And the administration needs to act now, not in 30 days.
You mentioned reports in your answer, and in your op-ed for The National, you described Washington's policy on Gaza, among other things, as, quote, illegal. There are also the reports that you mentioned, which are, you said, provided evidence of Israel's breach of several laws and acts, using those American-made weapons even to commit war crimes. What is the reaction internally in Washington to those reports? What do those reports prove, and who makes ultimately a decision on whether to listen to these reports?
Secretary Blinken makes the ultimate decision. And the fact that he and others that are surrounding him refused to listen prompted not only my resignation, but the resignation of another subject matter expert, Stacey Gilbert. I'm sure your audience has perhaps heard of her, who was one of the authors of the report that had to go to Congress, citing that Israel was blocking humanitarian assistance. It wasn't only her opinion, it is the opinion, because it's not an opinion, it's facts on the ground, verified by our own experts. And once it got to the political level, at Secretary Blinken's level, and there were others involved at a very high level, they changed the facts. That's not how American diplomacy works. In my 18 years, at least I didn't see it. Perhaps it worked that way then, but at least I didn't see it. And it was the same with me, where I was sending in daily reports. I did receive some humane responses. I did get some responses. Hala, your snapshots are going to the highest levels of our government. Please keep them coming. But then after months and months and still no action, not only no action, but things getting worse and more shipments sent and more vetoes at the UN. And then eventually in January, I personally was told, okay, your reports are no longer needed. So it became abundantly clear that information was no longer wanted, which is also very concerning, because these types of silencing, whether it's mine, Stacey's, or any others, it sends an absolute chilling effect across the entire department. And in my 18 years of service, I've never seen a level of self-censorship the way I saw it before I left the department. People are scared to speak out.
You mentioned the Leahy Law. What is it? Why was it put in place? How does it apply in the case of Israel's war in Gaza and Lebanon?
Leahy Law was established by Senator Leahy, and it is a law that basically says any foreign military unit that has committed gross human rights violations is not able to receive any type of U.S. military assistance. That includes even training. There is ample, undisputed evidence that multiple IDF units have committed gross human rights violations, and not just since October 7th, not just in Gaza, but way before, right? That has been willfully ignored. I worked on Leahy in past assignments, and we used to pull from open source information about various soldiers, various units. We used to look for things to make sure that we were completely in the clear. The amount of information that is out there is so much, and it's so abundant, and it's so credible, that the fact that the US administration is willfully ignoring it, to me, is a clear indication that this has nothing to do with the law. It has everything to do with political will.
I want to ask two questions in one. How have you seen the US's relationship with Israel change, if at all, during your time as a diplomat? And would you say that Israel has been the exception to the Leahy Law?
I mean, the clearest exception to the Leahy Law, absolutely, without a doubt. We have inconsistencies in many places, but the level of blatant violation, I think, is unprecedented when it comes to the state of Israel at the moment. And to answer your first question in terms of changes, I do think there have been changes because honestly, President Biden, one of the first things that he did, and it gave me a lot of hope as a diplomat working in this region, one of the first things that he did when he became president was give UNRWA funding because President Trump had pulled UNRWA funding back. He also appointed for the very first time a special representative for Palestinian affairs in the State Department. That was a bit revolutionary, right? What my talking point was as a State Department official was we can't try to broker peace if we're only talking to one side. And we need to be talking to both sides. And that was under President Biden. So I was very hopeful. Unfortunately, we've all seen that it's been quite the opposite and absolutely dire. But I do think that there's been a shift in that regard. If that's at the micro level, if you want to zoom out at the macro level, it's always been the same consistent. Israel is our strongest ally in the region. We have a steadfast, ironclad relationship. That has never changed. But at the micro level, I did see some changes that had given me hope that there could be progress.
What do you make of the relationship between Israel and the US in terms of how seemingly disjointed things have been appearing? Is Israel outright defying or ignoring the US? And does the US have a, quote, red line for its support of Israel?
I don't think Israel has a reason to listen to the US. We've given them everything that they want. I mean, it's literally diplomacy 101. You have to use your leverage. It's a negotiating skill. Why would Netanyahu listen to us when we're giving him every single weapon that he wants? We did a tiny pause on a very small shipment, and then he protested and we released it right away. I mean, he knows that Biden is bluffing whenever he says there's a red line. And again, as an American diplomat, that was intensely frustrating that our president was being humiliated time and time again, that this policy was threatening US national security. It's devastating to the Palestinians without a doubt, and it's not even effective in keeping Israel safe. Netanyahu is doing what he can get away with, and that's the bottom line. And the fact that we've given him this 30 days to me is so absurd. He's probably laughing. When he got that letter, he probably laughed. We've sent the THAAD, right, which is basically giving him incentive to do a hard strike on Iran, because now he knows he's protected by our US soldiers. And then he has announced a complete siege of northern Gaza, irrespective of the fact of whether you're pro this or pro that. It's just success or failure, right? Has the Biden administration succeeded in doing what it said it wants to do? No. It is an absolutely failed policy because we refuse to use our diplomatic leverage.
What does Israel have that the US wants so bad that makes it continuously supporting it no matter what? It's like an unconditional support.
It's strategic interests. I think it's interest domestically in terms of the political situation in the US, right? I mean, there's strong lobbies, and I'm not talking just about the pro-Israeli lobby that everybody knows, AIPAC and all, but there's also the arms industry in the United States as well that has an incentive to keep this war going. And there is profit in war. And so there are a lot of interests within the United States that want war to continue. It's known the strategic value of Israel for the United States, our greatest ally in the region. But there's so much going on because it's not just Israel in the region, right? It's everything else and everyone else. And one of the things that I stressed when I was still a diplomat is the consequences of our actions when it comes to the broader Middle East. And these consequences are going to be generational.
The US has been accused of shielding Israel from accountability for potential war crimes. It has used its veto about 47 times against UN Security Council resolutions it viewed as critical of Israel. That's half of its total veto count. And reports of misconduct by Israeli military units submitted to Congress have not resulted in any consequences. We also heard Biden saying that nobody has supported Israel the way that his administration does, which, if Israel was found guilty of war crimes, would actually be incriminating to the administration. The US had been put on notice by investigators and human rights groups that it may be complicit in war crimes because of Israel's unlawful use of American-made weapons. What makes the US so confident that it will not face any consequences for its role?
Another critical aspect of this is that this is not just about Gaza. It's not just about Palestine. It's not just about Israel. But this is setting a precedent for the rules-based order, international order, the world order, whatever you want to call it, right? And if we all decide to live in a world where there is no international law, where international humanitarian law is not protected, where ICC prosecutors are threatened and they stand down. What type of world is that? It is a threat to everyone. And so one of the things that I actually said as a spokesperson, because I refused to give interviews on Gaza, and one of the many reasons I outlined was international law. And I said, if I put my face out there and I'm the one promoting this policy, I could potentially violation of international law. I will not do that. And I was told, just don't worry about it. Literally, I was told, don't worry about it. That's not your concern. Just go ahead and do it. And I said, no, that is my concern. I have deep respect for the lawyers that brought the case to the ICJ. And I watched that case very closely. And it's irrefutable, right? And so I also said, plausible genocide. You expect me to go out on these talking points, put my face out there to promote this policy on something that has been determined by the ICJ to be plausible genocide? No, don't worry about it. The US assumed that it is above international law. It is deciding to set that precedent. That means Putin can also decide he is above international law. That means Iran can decide they are above international law. It means anyone can decide they are above international law. We can't have it both ways as the United States. We can't. We can't be the beacon of democracy, promoting rules, the rules-based order, promoting freedom of press, promoting human rights, but at the same time doing this. We just can't have it both ways.
To better understand the US rationale behind its record-setting military support for Israel, I speak to retired Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz, defense researcher at the RAND Corporation and former US Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I asked him about the most recent defense boost by the US amid escalating tensions between Israel and Iran. This week, the US approved the transfer of an advanced anti-missile system for Israel and troops to operate with it. Meanwhile, the US is trying to work with Israel to talk about which strikes to hit in Iran, telling Israel not to strike nuclear or oil facilities. What is the US thinking with regards to Israel, given how little Israel has been listening to anyone, really, including the US when it comes to military operations in the region?
The last exchange that took place between Iran and Israel with the approximately 180 ballistic missiles, clearly the United States has told Israel that they have the right and responsibility to respond to that attack. Like you just mentioned, we deployed the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System into Israel. It's been there before, but it's there to strengthen their air defense capability against the likelihood of another attack by Iran after Israel responds to this latest attack. In terms of what the U.S. is advising Israel to strike, there's no, I think, clear assessment out there, at least from the security professionals I listen to, that Israel could be successful in doing anything major against Iran's nuclear development capability, other than maybe targeting select individuals that are key to their program. So what the U.S. has been advising, both publicly and I presume privately, at least from sources that report that there are plenty of viable military targets that the United States and I think a lot of the international community feel Israel is justified to strike, and doing so will allow Israel to respond in a manner that they can ideally reestablish deterrence with Iran without going after civilian infrastructure, petroleum development facilities, etc.
But what is the guarantee that Israel will actually listen to this advice? And how can we interpret the US-Israeli relationship that while the US is calling for a de-escalation and trying to advise Israel on targeting something that would not further inflame tensions, it is also sending Israel weapons and bolstering its own military presence in the region? It seems that the US is following Israel's lead and not actually working together with it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the U.S. is following Israel's lead. I do agree that they've certainly listened, but they haven't taken into action the recommendations from the United States in many cases since the outset of the conflict. So we're going to know to what degree the Israeli Minister of Defense and ultimately Netanyahu is listening to our administration and our defense experts when ultimately they take this strike against Iran. I think the leverage that the U.S. does have, which ideally it's being spoke very candidly in private, is we've got 40,000 U.S. service members operating in the region. We have spent billions of dollars since the outset of this conflict in protecting Israel. So between the US, the UK, and other nations that have a significant military presence, I mean, I think that is our leverage. I can understand the position of Israel. It's just my concern is not so much the escalation. My concern as a former security professional is the innocent loss of human life. And then second most concerning is there's no indication that Israel has put any concerted effort into developing a plan for long-term stability inside of Gaza, for long-term stability in the West Bank, and far more difficult, I think, in Lebanon, certainly given the status of their government and how ingrained Lebanese Hezbollah is within the entire fabric of civil society and government in Lebanon. The international community is working hard to provide recommendations, but I'm not seeing any intent on behalf of Israel to take that on.
Since 2018, the US has been providing Israel $3.8 billion every year in mostly military assistance. And in addition to that, this past year alone, it spent a record $17.9 billion on military aid to Israel. And then even more money to fend off the Houthi Red Sea attacks, and not even factoring Israel's new front in Lebanon or the Iranian one that we are about to see soon. Speaking strictly about finances, is there a ceiling for how much the US is willing to spend on Israel's own, frankly, wars in the region?
I don't know that there is a ceiling. Certainly, as defense bills have gone forward for military assistance or military aid, those proposals coming out of the executive branch and our National Security Council had to go before our Congress for approval. And there's historically been bipartisan support for the defense of the Israeli state. So I don't believe that there is a ceiling that's set. We certainly have an annual appropriation that is given for our military assistance that we predominantly push through the Department of State. But again, in times of crisis or conflict, or in this now well over a year of combat operations, supplemental appropriations take place based on the need of our partners and allies.
While the US remains in a tough position over its role in a war that may have expanded beyond its expectations, Iran also has to decide what strategy it's going to take if Israel does strike back for its missile attack at the start of October. To speak about this, I'm joined by Alex Vatanka, founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. So Alex, in response to the US transferring an anti-missile defense system to Israel this week, Iran's foreign minister warned Washington that Tehran has, quote, no red lines when it comes to defending its people and its interests, and that the US was willing to put its own troops at risk by sending personnel to operate those systems that it's sent. Should we take Iran at face value when it says that? And it seems to us so far that there have been no red lines either on the Israeli side. Are we heading into a direct escalation between Israel and the US and Iran? How dangerous is the situation right now?
Well, the one thing I can tell you is that it is obviously unprecedented and quite a dangerous situation. But to the core of your question in terms of American and Iranian calculations, look, I think it's very clear neither side wants that open, direct, hot war where US and Iranian forces start shooting at each other. In fact, the opposite is true. In fact, you could argue that much energy is being invested as we speak directly between Washington and Tehran. Now, at the same time, both sides are trying to shape the calculations of the other. So when the Americans provide the Israelis with more weaponry, as we've seen with the THAAD systems, then as you've heard from Iran, they will react. But again, all that might suggest that we are on the brink of a regional war. My point is that is exactly what both Washington and Tehran trying to avoid for now. Can they avoid it? That's a different matter because there are other actors involved here, namely Israel. And as United States and Israel remain close allies, the simple truth is the Israelis have said repeatedly and openly that if they feel that they have to go alone without the United States against Iran, they might choose to do so.
We talked earlier about how Israel may not exactly listen to what the US has been advising it to do. There are often times that we've seen Israel act unilaterally when it comes to certain things that reports say the US did not approve of necessarily ahead of time, such as Nasrallah's killing, or Ismail Haniya's targeting in Tehran, or even the pager attacks in Beirut, across Lebanon as well. Let's say we get into that scenario that Israel hits Iran and does not hit the targets that Iran is expecting or bracing for. What happens next?
Let me just take the first part of what you said in terms of U.S.-Israel relations. It's a very close relationship going back decades. It is politically probably one of those issues where you find quite a bit of bipartisan support here. Democrats and Republicans tend to, by and large, be very supportive of that relationship with Israel. Are the Israelis going to sacrifice that relationship by doing things that the Americans will find troubling or undermining American interest? The Israelis will maybe do that, but I think as of right now, they know in Israel that they're still better off with the United States on their side than upsetting the United States. The speculation out there, obviously, and some of that speculation now has, in the last few days, become more of sort of concrete statements coming from the US side, which is that Israel has said they're not going to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. But if it's anything significant, if it involves Iranian casualties on a larger scale, then this is a regime in Tehran right now that really has to prove to its own people and those supporters of the Islamic Republic in the region that it is not entirely incapacitated, that it can do things to defend itself. So again, that puts us on that tit for tat kind of a danger. And at some point, it might become a situation that nobody can control. We're not there yet. We're not there yet because I don't think the Israelis believe, as of today, that they are in a situation where they can destroy Iranian nuclear facilities. Certainly not with the United States.
Is that what we're seeing from the foreign minister who's been on tour in the Arab region, in Riyadh and Doha, and several other places? I think today he is in Jordan, to rally political support for a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon and to prevent a wider regional war. Can Iran rally that Arab support that it needs to help the US convince Israel from retaliating altogether, or just to stop the war from expanding, or a third option maybe for a ceasefire altogether?
By and large, the Arab public opinion, and certainly Arab governments, majority of, do not necessarily think Iran's approach to Israel is good for the region or good for the respective countries. Yes, when Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, travels in the region, he's trying to do a few things. One is to say to Arab countries, particularly those that look to Iran for leadership, that Iran is not defeated. He also wants to say to Arab friends of the United States to put pressure on Washington, to in turn to put pressure on Israel to stop a major Israeli escalation, which might force Iran to, retaliate in kind. And again, we get into that moment where things might get out of hand once and for all. But I think in terms of war or bigger war going forward, that obviously depends on the calculations, namely right now in Israel. I mean, the Israelis have to make a decision. Is this the moment for them to go in and entirely dismantle the axis of resistance? If that's where Israel goes, then the bigger question becomes, will the United States support that Israeli effort? Again, these are political decisions. I doubt it. I doubt the United States will tell Israel that go for it, because the United States right now has just come out of 20 years of wars in the region where it essentially couldn't even defeat Taliban in the long term. So, and the Israelis have already occupied Lebanon once before. They have done this before. So I don't know. My gut feeling tells me that with the right diplomatic efforts, the willingness of different parties to compromise, that we might just be able to end this round of violence. But it's really important that very quickly two things happen for this region going forward. One is that Iran, the Islamic Republic, gives up the idea of a mughawama, essentially in practice, not in rhetoric. They don't have to say they will give it up, but in practice, they have to stop using missiles and rockets at Israel as a way of protecting the Palestinians. That hasn't worked, and it's not going to work going forward. Equally important is for the Israelis to recognize that the Palestinian people are not going to go anywhere, that there are people that have certain rights, and Israel needs to get on board, Israeli society needs to get on board on the two-state solution track as the way of the future.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Visit thenationalnews.com for the latest update on this story and our reporting on the war in Gaza, Lebanon, and the region. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.